Hello, everybody. I just got the word that we can start. It sounds like a lot of people are here, but we can't see you, so it's a little strange. But welcome wherever you are. I'm Kate Irvin. I'm curator of costume and textiles at the RISD Museum, and I'm so excited to be part of this conversation with Ying Bonny Cai. This is an event that's hosted by the RISD Museum and RISD's Alumni Club of Southeast Michigan. I'd also like to thank 2A-Tran and the Office of Alumni and Family Relations for their support of this event today. And so it is my true pleasure to be able to introduce Bonny and to serve as an interlocutor with any questions that any of you may have. Please don't be shy. Feel free to use the Q&A function as thoughts arise during Bonny's presentation. We'll be sure to leave time at the end to address all of your comments and questions. We'll leave about 10 minutes at the end. So, I want to start my introduction on a personal note that I think is a perfect illustration of Bonny's commitment to engaged and deeply thoughtful research. Bonny had visited us in the museum with her classes and individually for a couple of class research projects, but we connected much more substantially in 2017 at the very beginning of her fifth and final year of the Brown RISD dual degree program in which she was studying economics and apparel design. At this point, right at the start of the semester in September, she was getting all of her ducks in a row for her graduation capstone project. And here you see Bonny at the very end of that year. So rewind all the way back to the beginning of that year. This is a presentation that's meant to synthesize her passions at both schools, at both Brown and RISD. And so Bonny approached my colleague Lori Brewer and me to set up appointments to look at and learn from garments and textiles in the collection of the RISD Museum. So Bonny's soon going to be talking in much, much more detail about her thesis and research interests. So I'll only say here at this point that we were about to embark on a year-long deep dive in our collections, looking at the ways specific garments and textiles could support Bonny's research interests in clothing, construction, identity, and memory. Not switching, just to hold just a moment. There we go. So I just wanted to digress to here for a moment to say that for about 14 years now, the Costume and Textiles Department in the museum has offered what we call open hours during the semester. And this is a set time during the week when we as curators kind of field student requests to look at objects in the collection that might feed their research and kind of creative interests. And these are requests that really are, come from all different directions and often have led us as curators down paths that we could never have imagined. So needless to say, this is actually such a wonderful, fun part of our job. And for the past 6 years, we've done this work, these sessions in the Donghia Costume and Textile Study Center that you see here. This is a space that's used for teaching classes, but also, as you can see here, for individual student research, really close looking. It was in the study center where Lori Brewer and I first had the pleasure of meeting Bonny in person, starting with her initial request to look at traditional East Asian pants to study their geometric pattern cutting and engineered construction. We moved on to ensuing visits over the course of the year where Bonny looked at clothing from Christina Kim's DOSA label. Christina Kim is also an honorary degree recipient from RISD, as well well as runway fashions from Comme des Garçons and Issey Miyake. And you can see kind of a clip here in the center bottom of an Issey Miyake dress that particularly captured Bonny's fancy. She was also looking at Qing Dynasty Chinese coats, as you can see here, a Japanese kind of rural laborers workwear that you see here at the bottom right, and then at Korean pojagi, just to name a few of the pieces that Bonny looked at during her time with us. All of this close looking fed into not only Bonny's capstone presentation, but also into her stunning apparel thesis collection that explored the ways in which clothing promotes play, fosters empathy, and creates a sense of home. And we're now so happy to have one of these pieces from the thesis collection in the care of the museum. And that's the complex and tender joint pojagi ensemble that you see here on these two models. It's so rich with meaning and such a sensitive expression of Bonny's intensive research within and outside the museum. And now we're able to bring this piece out for future researchers to study and admire, much along the lines of what Bonny did in our collections before. So after showing highlights from her thesis collection, including this piece during New York's Fashion Week in 2018, Bonny showed work in a juried exhibition at the Textile Art Center in New York, as well as in a solo show titled Ocean, Moon, Sky at the Korean Cultural Center in New York in 2019. At this point, she was also designing knitwear at Madewell, and she was putting together an impressive application to the Fulbright Foundation for a fellowship to study art and design and craft in South Korea, a fellowship which she was duly awarded for the 2019-2020 cycle. And here we are, pretty much. Bonny only returned home in July of this year, so just months ago, home to Michigan. And from there, she's already started working at Free Assembly, a sustainable activewear startup. And she has so much to tell us about her trajectory, inspirations, adventures, and research. So without any further ado, welcome, Bonny, and thanks for being so much of an inspiration yourself.
Thanks so much, Kate, for that lovely introduction. I'm really glad we have a recording, so now whenever I need to make a good impression, I can just play that. Hi everyone, nice to meet you. My name is Bonny, and the pronouns I use are she, her, hers. I'd like to start by going back in time to the moment where, as Kate mentioned, I received the receipt for the joint pojagi piece Kate graciously received from me on behalf of the RISD Museum. And I distinctly remember the intense feeling I had when I tore open the envelope and read the fine print stating Ying Bonny Cai, American. And I felt this wave of emotion and unease wash over me because it was the first time I was seeing myself so concretely labeled as American. After all the years of being asked, where are you from? And checking boxes for Asian/Asian American, to just see American felt new and strange. And although I will be sharing my research on traditional East Asian costume and work driven by the Asian American community, I hope that by the end, you may also consider this a presentation on what it means to be American. I became interested in apparel as the form of art closest to the body, both physically as well as psychologically. As such, clothing is a powerful medium to channel intimacy, a concept I sought to express through a knitwear collection, inspired by my obsession with looking through other people's windows, which is also the original form of Instagram. In his film, Chungking Express, Hong Kongese filmmaker Wong Kar-wai tells the story of a waitress who falls in love with a policeman and proceeds to break into his house and rearrange his life. So this playful curiosity towards a stranger's universe, along with the color palette and mood of the film, I translated into knitwear. I rendered apartment facades from my relatives' homes in Hong Kong into a mosaic of colorful textured rectangles woven into a knit dress. Glass panes and soft curtains become moving screens as I watch the peculiar lives of strangers unfold. Transparent pleats, jersey pom-poms, and light silhouettes interplay to convey a sense of comfort and intimacy through voyeurism. Another concept that connects strangers and builds intimacy are stories. I found inspiration of such in the form of Taoist priest robes, which I got to study at the RISD Museum Costume Institute as well, where embroidered symbols allude to ancient allegories. For example, on the corner of every robe are two medallions, one representing the sun and the other representing the moon. A three-legged crow sits in the sun, alluding to the myth of the Jade Emperor summoning an archer to shoot down 9 of the former 10 suns in order to save the world from burning. In the moon, a rabbit mixes an immortality elixir while keeping company to the archer's wife, who was banished by the Taoist gods for eating an immortality pill. Kate, Irvin, RISD Museum Costumes and Textiles Curator, explains in her analysis of symbolism on Taoist priest robes that these pieces mirror the cosmos onto the figure of the officiating priest. When the priest opens his arms, the square silhouette of the robe becomes fully apparent and its motifs symbolizing the heavens visible. Thus, in donning the robe, the priest embodies the conjunction of heaven and earth. Meanwhile, I was drawn to stories from East Asian melodrama, which depicted the transformation of family during the past half century due to rapid industrialization and infiltration of Western ideas. The films I watched in my Brown University Korean cinema class featured scenes as momentous as visiting the grave of a deceased brother and son to those as mundane as sibling quarrels. These themes of storytelling from Taoist priest robes and familial tension from East Asian melodrama came together in a collection inspired by the relationship between my parents. Growing up, the type of love I was exposed to was typically a youthful and Western interpretation. Contrasting that with the relationship I witnessed between my parents, I often found myself wondering whether or not they actually loved each other. This piece was inspired by my mother's name meaning moon and my father's name meaning ocean. Like the relationship between these two forces, my parents' affection towards each other is not apparent. However, it does exist in a subtle way, the mirroring of a father's harsh but sturdy lines with a mother's gentle yet wholesome curves in building a home. The seamless coordination of dropping off and picking up children, represented by details on garments that echo each other. A rhythmic push and pull that culminates in a satisfying sort of synchronization. In his theory on metaphor, Vietnamese American poet Ocean Vuong emphasizes the power of metaphor and simile to allow us to look deeply into relationships of things that may seem disconnect, and hence metaphor is a practice of compassion. In this sense, I'd like to develop a practice of art that creates clothing as metaphor, as something that can connect myself to others and others to each other in perhaps a way that makes us all feel less lonely. So now moving on to my apparel thesis, I'm realizing these images might be loading a bit slow, so apologies. The summer of my junior year, I interned in Tokyo at a company where the CEO wanted international interns to experience his rural hometown. So he flew us out on an all expense paid trip to Hiroshima Prefecture, where we biked 70 kilometers along the coast, explored Rabbit Island, visited an underwater shrine. Overall, it was a really incredible time. But one of the most impactful moments was waiting at a train station where I saw this traditional jacket mounted on the wall. If you look closely, the embellishments on the jacket resemble the figures wearing the jacket on the wall photographs. Unfortunately, the train arrived and I wasn't able to decipher more, but this experience, along with summer festivals I attended later on, moved me deeply through the spirited symbolism that unified cloth, body, and culture. Returning to campus, I led the East Asian Studies student group at Brown University, a community working to reconcile our tumultuous histories between our motherlands while sharing stories of diaspora identity. Our experiences were linked together through post-memory, a coin turned by scholar Marianne Hirsch to describe the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal and collective trauma of those who came before to experiences they remember only by means of stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up. But these experiences were transmitted to them so deeply and effectively as to seem to constitute memories on their own. Post-memory's connection to the past is thus actually mediated not by recall, but by imaginative investment, projection, and creation. And I believe post-memory is a term that I resonate strongly with as diaspora Asian American, but I also believe can be felt strongly regardless of your identity and past. And so my thesis collection explored themes of childhood nostalgia, cultural inheritance, and the spirit of home. Research was heavily based on cultural heritage, which as a means of traversing time and continents, provides an opportunity for diasporic Asians to reimagine and rebuild relationships with their ancestors' past. My thesis advisors, Lori Brewer and Kate Irvin at the RISD Museum's Costume Institute, helped me access Qing Dynasty robes, Japanese fisherman jackets, and Korean men's pants. The garments draw from traditional East Asian clothing for draped forms that encompass the body lightly but protectively. Meticulous textile manipulations, raw edges, and incongruous layering express endeavor and exhaustion in piecing memories together. And next, I'll just talk a bit about casually, but about some of the research and process behind the thesis collection that was done closely in relation with the RISD Museum in Cape. So here you can see that while I was looking at traditional textiles at the RISD Museum, I stumbled upon these Japanese stencils called katagami. And these stencils are handmade with mulberry paper and coated with persimmon tan for strength and water resistance, and were used to dye cloths of kimono and other traditional Japanese clothing. And then on the bottom, there's this patchwork panel from the exhibition Design as Repair. And from these two, I decided to try laser cutting the pattern from the bottom panel and creating this sort of stencil effect from the katagami, and use that laser cutting technique for this pair of pants, which ended up not making its way to the final collection because they were really fragile. As you can probably imagine, you can probably see pieces of it falling apart just as the model's wearing it, but it was still a really meaningful way to sort of explore these traditional crafts and try and reimagine them in new garments. Likewise, there was the traditional Japanese work jacket that Kate had originally shown. And I was really inspired and interested about the geometric construction and engineering behind these pieces. I have a sketchbook page on the bottom left corner that shows how this rectangular panel can actually transform into a sleeve based on strategic folding. And this is also a way to minimize fabric waste. And so I tried that on this sort of a reimagined poncho. You can see I created red lines to indicate the folding that I used and how that then transforms into this triangular sleeve piece. And something else that I noticed was most of the time when I was looking at traditional East Asian garments, they were displayed as opposed to on mannequins on rods, so that they were open and you could see the sleeve detailing. And I decided to also try that in presenting my own work through this piece called Ladder to the Sky that was part of the 10th annual Brown RISD dual degree exhibition. The Ladder to the Sky was actually an ode to Chinese artist Chai Guoqiang's 2015 Sky Ladder, where he lit a ladder on fire over his hometown of Quanzhou to celebrate his grandmother's 100th birthday. And he says, behind Sky Ladder lies a clear childhood dream of his. Despite all of life's twists and turns, he always wanted to determine and realize it. And it carries the affection for his hometown, where his relatives and friends live. In contrast to his earlier attempts, which set ignition time at dusk, this time the ladder rose towards the morning sun, carrying hope. And so sort of in that essence, I wanted to create these ladders that carried the apparel pieces that I had. And the statement I wrote was, look to the sky and reclaim. Colonialism, US militarism, and Western idolization have simultaneously eradicated and exotified the traditional fabric of our humble skins. In an ode to Taiko Chiang's ladder, I sew together my mother and father, admiration and camaraderie, history and hope. From top to bottom, I dye blue for my father's name, Ocean. I pull linen yarns that billow in the spring breeze. I assemble wings from panels of passionate friends. I trace a circle as full as my mother's heart of the moon. I combine front and back in denim, looking to the past and future. And another major symbolism throughout the collection is the wing motif drawn from sekdongo, which are traditional Korean jackets worn by young children on their birthdays. Their example is in the upper left corner. The jackets feature vibrantly striped sleeves whose colors represent harmony to bless children with good health and prosperity. I was also inspired by the Jidai Matsuri, or the Festival of Ages in Japan, which features a parade of ancient costumes from thousands of years ago to the present. This children's costume is of the mythical bird Karyobinga, an immortal creature from Buddhist paradise. In applying these silhouettes to my own apparel works, I wanted to, in essence, transform the generational daughter into a voyager, to bestow upon her the ability of flight in her journey for finding home. The second motif is poljagi, specifically from the Chosun dynasty, appeared when strict Confucian values denied women literary and artistic education of their male counterparts. Relegated to the home, women frugally collected scraps of fabric to sew together into poljagi. The careful making of poljagi was felt to confer blessings to the recipient, and they were often given by grandmothers and mothers as gifts to their children. I wanted to capture the specific moment of gift giving between females of different generations through a piece that physically encompassed two persons. And the third and final motif I'll be talking about is three-dimensional playfulness. For this, I looked to Issey Miyake's collection 1325. The name refers to the way a one-dimensional piece of cloth takes on a three-dimensional shape and is then folded into a two-dimensional flat surface. And in a way, wearing it transcends time and dimensions, in other words, 5 dimensions. I believe this multidimensionality of garments allows for greater interaction and play. And this is the Issey Miyake garment that Kate had mentioned prior by Dai Fujiwara, who was head of design there then, that I referenced a lot and tried to play around with. Here are the 2 muslins I had for the joint bozagi piece, as well as a sketchbook page where I was just fiddling around with candy wrappers and tracing origami lines to try and understand how to make this 3-dimensionality come to life. And this often meant that the most interesting parts of my garments weren't in the front. The little details I embedded throughout the garments reference precious moments in our lives that we once looked over. When you see someone you love from a different perspective and suddenly realize how many more gray hairs she has than before. How in the past the phrase, "have you eaten yet?" was thought to be nagging, but you've come to realize it actually means "I miss you." Particular attention to detail is given to the backs of my garments because I'd like to believe that our mothers still see us as being beautiful even as we are leaving them. And the highlight of my thesis collection was collaborating with my fellow dual degree peer and close friend, Minsu Thigpen, on a project that combined innovative painting, dynamic apparel, and intimate community. Minsu organized a workshop for a group of us friends to make paper kites together, which we flew at the RISD farm, which is actually a beach, dressed in apparel for my thesis collection. And we realized serendipitous parallels, such as our complementary color palettes and the effect of wind as it swept through kites and cloth. Going on to share a bit of my Fulbright experience. This part is a little less formal, less of a artist talk, because I'd really, rather than focusing on my work, would like to share my experience with you all and highlight the artisans and craftspeople and designers that I had met in Korea. So this is just a bit of an intro about the Fulbright program itself, but I was awarded a Fulbright Research Award to South Korea to study hanbok, traditional Korean clothing, including its history, symbolism, and influence on contemporary designers. Just to also be transparent, I am not Korean or of Korean descent. My parents immigrated from China, but I was born and raised in the US. So keeping that in mind, I was aware of my identity and context of the country I was visiting, namely that the United States has done a lot of sort of controversial things to the Korean Peninsula, such as randomly deciding on the border between North and South Korea, dropping bombs on innocent civilians during the Korean War, and upholding military regimes in the 60s and 70s. So going in, even though I had a plan to create this elaborate collection, the more I learned, the more I realized that not only was 10 months too short a time to accomplish such a large body of work respectfully, but there were already Korean designers and craft people promoting their traditional culture, and it was better for me to learn and listen to their voices and to share those experiences with you all. And so even here you see contemporary Korean designs in collaboration with high school students actually to reimagine school uniforms in a traditional Korean style. And I believe that the government actually, following this competition, was able to give stipends to high schools so that they could put these uniforms into production and actually be worn. And following, I'm just again going to talk more casually about some of the experiences that I had throughout the Fulbright, including museum research. The top images from the National Folk Museum of Korea that features more so everyday people's wear, where you can see it's much more plain and solid, simple colors compared to the bottom image, which is from the National Palace Museum of Korea, where garments were much more embroidered and elaborate and featured gold leaf printing. This piece or exhibition was for Jeju Island traditional hanbok, and this set specifically is karo, which is hanbok that's dyed with persimmon and was typically worn as workwear by farmers, because persimmon, which was also used as dye for the Japanese katagami stencils, is special in that it's helps strengthen a material. For clothing specifically, it's great because it's odor resistant and helps sort of give a water resistant quality that helps with perspiration and sweat and will keep the wearer cool. And I just included some of my sketchbook notes and sketches that I took while I was at this exhibition. Another really incredible feature at the exhibition were diving uniforms called muljoksam that are worn by Jeju Island female divers. Diving for precious seafood actually is an exclusively female role in Jeju Island, said to be because a lot of times men would die out at sea. And so Jeju Island is known for having three really strong forces. It said the wind, the spirit, and the woman of the island. And so you can see, again, similar to previous engineering of traditional garments, I was following the geometric patterning as well as some photographs of women actually wearing the diving suits. I was also a guest student or researcher at Ewha Women's University, where I attended classes with the graduate students. And it's interesting because the costume department was part of the life sciences as opposed to art and design department or college. And that really speaks to what science, the amount of sort of scientific approach that these students were taking to costume and trying to replicate the garments exactly and really understand the materials and the sewing construction and engineering behind them. And I also finally was able to learn traditional hanbok sewing, because before, while I was at RISD, I was really just trying to find images and tutorials online and looking mostly through books and replicating more so the image and photograph than really understanding the full process behind it. So I learned a lot from this, namely, for instance, that before I was sewing the sleeve cuff as an actual like folded over cuff, but it's actually an extra panel, and the full lining behind is what creates a fold at the edge of the sleeve. So a lot of those construction details came into more clarity from taking this class. I also studied a lot of traditional Korean craft work, such as poljagi. This time previously all my poljagi had been machine sewn, which my teacher or crafts master in Korea very vehemently emphasized was not true poljagi. True poljagi is all done by hand. And she showed me these incredible works by contemporary poljagi masters where everything is sewn by hand. It's just like so mind-blowing because their lines are so straight and each stitch is like the perfect eighth inch. I'm like getting tingly just thinking about it. It's like so incredible, these craftsmen and the works. So being introduced to that was really humbling for me. And my final piece in that class was a fully hand-sewn vest made of fabric I had dyed with oolong tea. And the fabric is called reimi, in Korean it's called mochi. It's this really incredible natural fiber that I had never used in the States, but it's sort of like if linen and organza had a baby. It's like it creases like paper and has this really beautiful transparent quality to it. And it was really wonderful to get to work with this new material. Another traditional skill I learned was made-up, which is traditional knot tying. Which is also really incredible because as you can see from the center top panel, like I couldn't even tell what was going on when my teacher was teaching me these like elaborate loops to make, but in the end, it creates these really beautiful floral knots. And made-up knot tying, this skill was traditionally used for norige, which is on the far right, which are these pendants that women would wear as ornaments with hanbok, because traditionally, especially middle to lower class women couldn't necessarily afford the intricate embroidered fabrics or the gold leaf printed silks that royalty could, and wore more simple and plain hanbok, which was also sort of a Confucian motivated value of like simplicity and bareness. But in order to balance that and to add some ornamentation, they would wear these pendants, norige. And I also attended traditional fabric dyeing workshops. This one specifically is for safflower dye, which was a very important color at that time because it can achieve this deep red, as you can see on this dragon robe. And it was a really interesting process because after the flowers are dried, what happens is you have to rinse out the yellow pigment from them, which is water soluble. And the more you rinse out the flower, they rinsed it out like 20 sometimes, the deeper the red you can achieve. And this is them dyeing their final fabrics in the deep red bath that they had finally rinsed out the flowers to be. I combined all of these skills and museum historic knowledge I had learned into this website, Hanbok Heroes. And the following is just sort of a brief overview of Korean costume history based on what I learned, because it's not really as accessible or featured in the States compared to Japanese and Chinese costume history. But I feel as though there's a wave of that changing as more Korean history and costume and art scholars emerge in America. But starting with the Three Kingdoms period, what some of the earliest records of hanbok were on mural painting walls. As you can see here, there's still that iconic V-shaped neckline and these like contrast color bands at the neckline and sleeve cuff. And men wore a shirt and trousers, and women wore a longer robe. It looks like they still are wearing trousers underneath. And then there's also, this is a painting actually from a Chinese scroll depicting ambassadors from each of the three kingdoms. But despite different colors and embroideries and fabrics that were used, the general shape and sort of formula for the jacket remained consistent. Next is the Unified Sheila period. I know these two figurines are really blurry, but from these earlier times, it's harder to find as many paintings or even like actual garments that lasted. But from the figurines, you can see slightly that for a woman, the skirt was worn above the jacket, above the chest. And this was actually borrowed from Tang Dynasty China, which had helped the Xia kingdom defeat the other two Goguryeo and Baekje kingdoms. And so during this time, a lot of Korean hanbok attire was inspired by Tang Dynasty China. Next, during the Goguryeo kingdom, hanbok was heavily influenced by Buddhism, which was the major religion at that time. And from this painting, in the far corner, you can see these intricately golden thread embroidered hanbok pieces that were mostly red, green, and white. Moving on to the Chosun dynasty, which is the major dynasty during Korea. Early Chosun jogori or jackets were actually quite similar between men and women. They were both around like low hip length, had wide sleeves. But as the Chosun dynasty progressed, because it was a Confucian dynasty and Confucianism is a very patriarchal and sort of sexist philosophy, women's jackets got shorter and shorter because they didn't want to allocate as much fabric, and also because women were increasingly delegated to the home, whereas men's hanbok and attire developed more elaborate outerwear. The lower middle panel you can actually see the progression through each of the centuries on how women's jackets got so short to that you can see on the far right in the late Chosun dynasty in this painting, Portrait of a Beauty by lifestyle painter Shin Yoon-bok, that you can actually see like the chest band of the skirt underneath because the jacket is so short. And following during the Korean Empire is when Western clothing was first introduced through mostly military attire from Japanese soldiers that were coming in during that time. Here is Emperor Gojong in a military uniform. And it was also during this time that men more so were allowed to wear Western wear, whereas women were still delegated to wearing traditional Korean clothing. And even now, a lot of times in Korean, Japanese, and Chinese, maybe like ceremonies or special events, you see men wearing like suits or more Western attire and women wearing still the traditional attire. During the colonial period, when Korea was colonized by Japan, hanbok took on a new meaning because the Japanese had banned hanbok from being worn. During the March 1st independence movement, the protesters wore white hanbok as a symbol of their defiance. And following Korean liberation from Japanese colonialism and moving into modern South Korea, during this time, Western wear became more prominent. It was given as relief wear, and hence it wasn't something that was considered just for men or as unaffordable as during the Korean Empire. And conversely, hanbok became more something delegated to special ceremonies, so it became much more decorative and elaborate. Here's a 1970s design by hanbok designer Lee Ri-ja, and you can see that there are these like the tie becomes like incredibly long and thick and sort of impractical. And in contemporary South Korea, there are three sort of main variations of hanbok. The first is pioneered by designer Lee Young-hee, who sort of wanted to create hanbok haute couture. She infamously presented hanbok designs at Paris Fashion Week, where women didn't wear the traditional jacket, they would just wear the banded skirt. And even though this seems like maybe not as big a deal at this time because women wear all sorts of different silhouettes. During that time, it was really sort of scandalous to wear a hanbok without the jacket. And so her sort of reinventing hanbok in that way was really significant. The next are rental hanbok, which can be sort of a tricky situation in South Korea because it's argued that these hanbok aren't really traditional hanbok. Like if you can see, she has a set-in sleeve, and there's actually like a hoop skirt underneath there. And traditionally, women achieve that volume by wearing layers and layers of undergarments. But obviously, no one wants to put on like 10 pairs of underwear just to visit a palace and wear a traditional Korean garment. So a lot of contemporary rental hanbok shops sort of make do. And during my time there, I think when I first saw rental hanbok, it was a bit uncomfortable. It reminded me of instances of cultural appropriation that I had witnessed when I was in the States. But when I talked to Korean peers, some of them felt similarly and were frustrated that rental hanbok deviated so much from traditional hanbok, whereas others were like, you know, if it gives a way for people to experience our traditional culture as closely as possible, and especially makes them more motivated to visit our palaces and take pictures and learn more about traditional Korean culture, they were happy for that. And through that experience also, I realized that Korean cultural appropriation wasn't for me to decide as someone who was very much an outsider, as someone who's American/Asian American. And the last main category of contemporary hanbok is lifestyle hanbok. Sort of similarly to rental hanbok, this hanbok takes more contemporary elements such as a set-in sleeve, sort of a less voluminous sleeve shape, and also like zippers for the skirt. But these designs are typically done and carried forward by Korean designers. And I actually had the opportunity to conduct interviews with these contemporary lifestyle hanbok designers. Hwang Yi-seo is one of the pioneers of this category, as well as interviews with traditional craftsmasters. Master Kueja is the government designated master of traditional Korean sewing in Korea, and ask on their opinions on sort of the evolution and future trajectory of hanbok. And it was really interesting because they had such contrasting things to say. For instance, lifestyle designer Hwang Yi-seo something she said that really stood out to me was, I just want to make hanbok more accessible so people will want to wear it more. Like if we kept hanbok the same as it was before, you know, the skirt's too long, girls will trip over it. Like what if it was something that women could wear just riding the subway? Whereas for Master Kueja, she was vehemently opposed to any sort of alterations to traditional hanbok, because for her, traditional hanbok was one of the few things after the industrialization of the city of Seoul in South Korea and so many changing patterns. Hanbok was one of the few things she felt truly held on to the old spirit of Korea while it was unified. And these conversations sort of made me reflect on my own work and what it meant to do fusion work, or quote unquote fusion. I'm not a fan of the term because I think rather than combining Eastern and Western, it's more like reimagining perhaps what Eastern apparel would have become if it weren't for Western imperialism. But in terms of this idea of authenticity and the controversy surrounding that, I recently listened to an interview on NPR's Fresh Air between Terry Gross and Chef David Chang, where Chef David Chang, Korean American diaspora himself, stated, quote unquote, "I find authenticity stifling. The idea of preserving one kind of deliciousness can be dangerous, and his practice of mixing cuisines is what he appreciates the most about food, because he states food is so beautiful because it can be anything and everything, and quote unquote, that's what makes American cuisine so wonderful." So sort of that idea of transformation and still keeping the spirit of traditional culture was something that I sought to recognize in other contemporary Korean designers, one of which is Ise, which means second generation in Korean, and this is a contemporary Korean streetwear brand, where you can see they're also sort of reimagining hanbok for a more contemporary, namely streetwear audience. But for these, for instance, like cargo pants, they've carried over the seam lines from traditional women's underdrawers, and then for some of their jackets, they follow the traditional color blocking of traditional children's jackets. And another brand that I really enjoy is called Sunday School, a traditional streetwear brand, or a contemporary streetwear brand based out of LA. And for these graphics specifically, they drew upon traditional military rank badges and the embroidery and symbols that are on those. And another prominent designer is Jiwon Choi. So for her most recent collection, which is on the left, she featured these hand-painted framing details that are inspired by traditional Korean architecture. And then on the right is a collaboration she did with Adidas that reinterpreted the three-stripe signature of the Adidas Originals brand with these long ties that are signature to traditional Korean clothing. And so after absorbing all of those really vibrant movements and artists and designers and words and craftsmen themselves, I finally felt comfortable trying to translate that into my own work, because for me, apparel has never been a means of the final product. I'm not trying to make clothing per se, but rather apparel has been the genuine means of which I process the relationships and news and feelings of the world around me. And so this ensemble I made is built up of conversations and stories between myself and my friends SK and YK as part of SK's podcast On My Way Home. I wanted to express how Korean Americans are reclaiming their identities as something that exists in their daily lives and that they cope with waking up and walking down the streets. When I spoke to my Korean American friends, many expressed that they didn't resonate with how traditional Korean clothing felt very gendered. And if you remember, as I mentioned, that main gender differentiation occurred during the Chosun dynasty. So for instance, this shirt jacket, I decided to reference more so early Chosun jackets where the gender divide wasn't as stark yet. And I contrasted utilitarian pockets associated with masculine army shirts with light, delicate fabric typically used for feminine garments. Meanwhile, the pants are based off traditional women's underdrawers, which women would wear multiple layers of during historic times, as I had mentioned. Nowadays, it's seen as a hindrance, but in the past, it was considered protection, so I wanted to bring them forward as the outermost surface. I wanted to break the stereotype that women only wore skirts and men wore pants by saying, no, women also wear pants and this is what they looked like. And this idea of everyday and routine made me think of uniforms and identity as a sort of uniform that we wear. Each person can wear this ensemble differently, but it's made of the same set of clothing that encompasses both wearers. Details are adjustable, such as sleeves that can be rolled up and tied multiple ways, and a waistband that can be worn lower for pants and over the bust for a jumpsuit. A key point is the pocket at the nape of the neck that wearers can put something they cherish in. Overall, we chose yellow to be the color that coated the garment because we thought yellow as the color of protest of the umbrella movement in Hong Kong and the ribbon of the Sewol ferry incident, and the color we associated with youth of school buses and backpacks. To us, yellow is the most gentle and powerful color, and that really resonated with my friends SK and YK's Korean American identities. And that's actually the end of my presentation. I know it's sort of an abrupt end, but I want to be conscientious of time, allow for questions in case there were any. And yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Bonnie. That was wonderful and as rich as I could have imagined. There's so much there. I just want to remind everybody that please feel free to jump in with any questions that you have. Just type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then I can kind of read them out there. Or even if you just have comments, I can share them out. But I'd love to start just with I've got lots of questions, lots of comments. But one thing that I just wanted to kind of ask you about is, there's so much, you've done so much research just for so many years at this point, in terms of studying traditional clothing construction and textiles, and we've heard so much about the ways that you've kind of brought your research and your observations into your own design. designs. And I'm also thinking about kind of your work in thinking about innovative and sustainable textiles that you've done with Madewell and now with Free Assembly, and wondering kind of where those two pursuits meet, like how thinking through East Asian clothing and textiles has informed your kind of research into and your kind of making in terms of sustainability and
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that's definitely still in the process. I think, for one, part of why clothing was so sustainable in traditional East Asia is because they didn't produce so much of it. And I think that's really hard to try and go back to that exact same practice and extent in the contemporary world. But it's more so like a value and lesson as opposed to like a clothing construction that we can learn from. And I think is increasingly being made more aware of and practiced. But it really is so different depending on, which city you live in or like the circumstances of which you grew up in. I also would like to point out that a lot of times sustainability thus far has been, for whatever reason, framed as something that's luxurious. Or I remember one of the earliest waves of like sustainable apparel was like luxury sustainable apparel, like made of all natural materials and like 100% silk. And that's like such a paradox on its own, because it's precisely communities where sustainability isn't therefore accessible to that climate change impacts the most, from the Flint water crisis, which is close to my home outstate of Michigan, to Native people's lands being sort of overrun by oil companies and oil drilling. So making sustainability something accessible, not to say that Madewell or Free Assembly are the most accessible of brands, but in terms of not being labeled as a luxury company was something that also sort of stood out to me, the way that sustainability was so universally practiced in traditional East Asian societies, and also society as a whole. I shouldn't exclude it to East Asian society. I think the early pilgrims also probably did not wear like 100 different dresses mass manufactured. And traditional dyeing, I think, is one of the main practices that I see being revived more so through artisans of all different backgrounds. The wonderful thing about traditional dyeing is that it has so many roots and practices. Like traditional indigo dyeing, even though we might associate with being Japanese, actually has really rich practices in Nigeria, as well as even like Western parts of the United States. And so, yeah, I guess I'm sort of thinking of ways in which these practices are now being brought back in the contemporary world. But to be honest, in terms of my personal practice, it's still sort of hard to necessarily bring those very traditional East Asian constructions to very corporate design. But I think in my personal practice, making clothes that are perhaps more, not to say my thesis collection wasn't wearable, but maybe more practical. If, for instance, Hwang Yisol, the traditional hanbok, lifestyle hanbok designer, wanted to make her hanbok something women could just wear on the streets or taking the subway or bus, trying to make my more of my practice and garments more accessible in that way would also be a form of sustainability, I think. So yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that connects to another question that I have, just in terms of kind of like bringing the traditional into the everyday, or back into the everyday, and the transformations that you're speaking of. I think, as part of your Fulbright application, you had talked about, sharing the spirit of hanbok, and the importance of kind of like cross-cultural appreciation, and sharing kind of the lives and aspirations of Eastern and Western audiences alike. And I know that also very early on in your junior year, you had written to us, kind of expressing the importance of apparel students kind of being exposed more to East Asian, and also just worldwide dress outside of Europe and the US. So I just would love to kind of hear more about kind of what you would hope that people would take away. And I think you've just spoken about that, but take what kind of like all of us can take away from what you've learned.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question because what I didn't mention in my presentation, but a big point I'd like to emphasize is that I mentioned I would like this presentation to also be seen as something of what it means to be American and diaspora. And a lot of what I came to the conclusion of from my research is that even though my parents immigrated from China and I might have Chinese blood, that doesn't make me exempt from appropriating Chinese culture. And that listening to those um, learning more about those stories and really trying to understand the root of where those details in garments and for instance like the Taoist priest robes and not just knowing about the three-legged crow and the rabbit but like where those stories come from and that oral tradition of mythology is what adds so much richness, not for the sake of being afraid of cultural appropriation but for really doing justice to the richness of that garment and everything it symbolizes. And also you know, just because I even went to Korea and studied all of this, I'm still very hesitant on whether or not I'm being culturally appropriative of hanbok when I try and reimagine it. I really don't want this presentation to seem like, oh, I went to Korea and I learned a lot, so now I'm like free of cultural appropriation. That's not it at all. Cultural appropriation very much is not like a black and white of whether or not you are or not doing it because it's subjective and it's something that is still being worked on. But I will say that I strongly believe rather than wanting cultural appropriation to spark fear of like, oh, I don't want to be culturally appropriative, so I'm just not going to wear Chinese clothing because I don't want to offend someone. Wouldn't it be so much more magical if we could use cultural appropriation as motivation to learn more about other clothings and costumes and customs, and therefore feel more comfortable to be wearing and appreciating those garments?
Yeah, I think that too. I mean, that leads right into kind of another comment slash question that I had, which is just, that I think that really connects to your discussions or your commitment to collaboration. I think that's something that comes up a lot, in the writing that I've read and in your talk, of course. And I think that's part of it too, right? Is that you're thinking in collaboration with when you're studying. I mean, all of the images and your experiences that you shared in South Korea are done with and alongside and in recognition of. And I think that there is that. I love that then that connection with the way that you were first talking about metaphor and connectedness and that the way that can also tie into collaboration. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to add about kind of the ways that you've collaborated or that you would kind of like to collaborate going forward.
Yeah, I don't think I necessarily, that's so interesting you bring that up because I don't think I go into each project thinking, oh, I want to collaborate with so and so on this, or like I want to do a collaboration with so and so, but rather it comes so naturally that because my apparel practice isn't a means to an end, it's a means to being less lonely and also a means of connecting with other people and of just like trying to process the emotions and relationships I feel. Collaboration comes more naturally as, for instance, like my friend Minsu, we hadn't compared our works to each other or like even I mean we had visited each other's studios temporarily but only because like Minsu forgot her brown homework at her studio or like I was really bored while seam ripping so she decided to come pay me some company. Like we never had necessarily those formal discussions about our work but just having discussions about our identity, hers as Korean diaspora, mine as Chinese diaspora, and our relationship with our families, and sort of how we were processing the global events of like who was elected at that time, automatically fueled the spirit, I think, that led to our works, and thus that connection had already existed just from the innate energy of which we were putting into the pieces we created. So moving forward, I'm just hoping to listen to more stories from friends and new friends and people I meet and always be open to the stories and backgrounds behind whoever or whatever opportunity may be forward and allowing the synergies that happen to occur naturally.
Mm, lovely. I love that. I'm just going to throw in, we have one comment from Diane who says that they love the pocket at the nape of the neck to hold something precious.
Oh, that's thanks, Diane. Appreciate that.
Do you have any other kind of like secrets that you know that you're think about
Mm, I
insert?
think in general, I do like really, first of all, pockets are so important. Sorry, I know that's random, but the fact that pockets are devoid of so much women's wear these days is unacceptable. That is something I try and like design into my like corporate or industry
Yes,
work.
please. Yes, please.
But I think pockets are also something that's symbolic and that I carry throughout my work. I didn't show as much in my thesis collection, but for instance, I had a denim kimono that even though kimono traditionally didn't have pockets, I still incorporated side seam pockets of because I like pockets as the idea of just something that like holds things that are precious. And the metaphor then of pockets as holding memory, as being these like safe havens for keeping things close to our bodies.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that speaks to kind of another my next question. I love how this is just flowing. You're straight into the questions that I was thinking about. So you mentioned and us. Especially in relation to your thesis collection, these notions of play and interaction, and we certainly see that in the joint Fujagi ensemble that we've now got in the museum. But you also, insert some pretty kind of strong emotional tugs. And I was really moved by this one sentence, if you don't mind my reading it,
Oh,
in
yeah, of
your
course.
capstone statement that says, particular attention to detail is given to the backs of my garments because I'd like to believe that our mothers still see us as being beautiful even as we're leaving them. And I love that so much, and I love that again that the emotions and the connections that you're creating, even as that tie, even as you're walking away. That image is there. I don't know if you wanted to just speak any more about that, or emotions and garments and the ways that we express ourselves, or the way that you might even see others who were wearing your garments kind of take the emotions that you're kind of inserting in them as a maker and moving on.
Yeah. That's a very difficult question, I think. Because part of the reason I make apparel is because I'm really terrible with words. And having to describe and explain and write things is like why I do visual art. And then I go to art school and everything needs an artist statement. And I'm like, why? But I do feel that in terms of my work being transformed and taking on different emotions once it's worn. A specific example would be I mentioned the collaboration I did with my friend Minsu, and one of our fellow friends who painted kites along with us and wore my pieces. Her name is Chonga. She's from Korea. I met up with her while I was in Seoul for my Fulbright, and for her, her grandfather was a really important figure in her life and has passed away. And unknowingly, the apparel garment that I had made was like a full white ensemble, and she chose that ensemble to wear. And later on, as we were flying the kite, she was like, "Oh, Ying, I wanted to let you know that I chose this ensemble because my grandfather had passed away. But white is a color that you wear for mourning in Korea, and being able to wear this traditional Korean garment, especially with the wings that symbolize sort of freedom." For her, it felt as though she was being able to let go or set free her grandfather's spirit.
That's beautiful. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. Well, I think we have that could be just a beautiful note to end on. It's 2 o'clock, but if there's anything else that you want to share or add, any words of advice to all of the makers, especially who are at home, especially in terms of kind of maintaining an emotional connection to our work, please feel free to share them or share that, or we can certainly end on that beautiful note.
Yeah. If anybody who attended this talk felt comfortable reaching out, I would love to meet you guys since I wasn't able to see you during this call and have these more intimate conversations. I'm not doing much other than like staying safely indoors. It's also snowing in Michigan, so I can't like go climb trees or anything exciting or hike. But yeah, I feel as though, if anything, I'm so thankful for you all for listening and hopefully making more connections through this opportunity. And really thankful to Kate and Tue, I didn't get to mention that at the beginning, for allowing me to share my work and stories.
Thank you so much. This is really, really wonderful and so nice to reconnect and to hear all of your beautiful thoughts and see your work.
Thank you. All right. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Goodbye. Take
Stay
care.
well.